The calm before the storm. The day started like any other for Private Jack Turner. The sun was barely rising over the military camp, casting long shadows across the rough terrain of the alien planet they were stationed on. Jack had spent the last few months in this desolate place, doing nothing but routine drills and guarding empty sectors. The war was still raging in other parts of the galaxy, but here, on the outskirts, there was only silence. No real battles, no sign of the enemy, just waiting. Jack had learned to accept this strange calm. It wasn't ideal, but it was safe. He thought it would last forever, but deep down, he knew something was wrong. The silence, the lull, it felt like a storm was building on the horizon, just waiting to break. The kind of storm that wouldn't let anyone survive if they weren't ready. And Jack, well, he wasn't sure if he was ready. His team had gathered for morning briefing, a quiet, almost peaceful moment. Sergeant Harris, a gruff veteran of many battles, stood at the front of the group, flipping through his notes. The other soldiers sat on crates, their eyes tired from lack of action. No one seemed concerned about anything happening today. But Jack, for reasons he couldn't explain, felt uneasy. "Listen up, people," Sergeant Harris's voice broke through the quiet. "We're still in the middle of nowhere, so don't get too comfortable. Command says we've got another week here. We keep watch, stay sharp. Nothing fancy, just the usual." The usual. Jack couldn't help but wonder how many more usual days they could endure. The military was stretched thin, with forces scattered across the galaxy. Battles were being fought in distant sectors, but not here. Not for them. Not yet. The briefing ended as quickly as it began. The soldiers drifted off to their stations, still half asleep, trying to shake off the boredom. Jack, however, couldn't ignore the feeling gnawing at the back of his mind. He looked up at the sky, half expecting to see something, anything, that would break the monotony. It was then that the first sign of change came. A strange signal cracked through their communication system. At first, it was just static. But then a voice, faint and distorted, emerged from the noise. Jack's heart skipped a beat. "This is urgent. We need assistance. Request. Immediate response." The voice cut out again, leaving the team in stunned silence. The signal wasn't from their own fleet. It wasn't a scheduled check-in or a routine message. This was a distress call. But from where? And who was it from? Could be a malfunction, Sergeant Harris muttered, shaking his head. "Keep monitoring it, Turner. See if you can clean it up." Jack rushed over to the communication station, his mind racing. He fiddled with the controls, trying to get the signal back. The static was maddening. But the words, urgent, assistance, immediate, they echoed in his head. Something wasn't right. Then, as if to answer his question, the signal returned. This time, it was clearer. "Attention. This is the Galactic Fleet. Request immediate evacuation. The enemy, unstoppable. We cannot hold them back." The message was cut short again, but it was enough to make Jack's blood run cold. The Galactic Fleet was one of the largest military forces in the galaxy. They had been engaged in a fierce battle with a ruthless alien race known as the Varkar. But how could they be asking for help? The Galactic Fleet was powerful, capable of holding its own against any foe. What was happening? Jack turned to look at his fellow soldiers. Their faces had gone pale. Harris was already barking orders, telling everyone to stay calm. But Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just another false alarm. This wasn't a drill. This was real. Something was happening out there, something far worse than they could have imagined. Suddenly, the ground shook. A low rumble echoed through the camp, and dust rose from the barren soil. It was subtle at first, but then it grew, turning into a violent tremor. Jack stumbled to his feet, grabbing his rifle, as the sound of approaching ships filled the air. The sky above them turned dark, as if a storm was brewing on the horizon, ready to unleash its fury. "We're not alone," Jack whispered to himself, his heart racing. Sergeant Harris turned to him, his face grim. "Get to the armory. Now." The soldiers moved quickly, their training kicking in. They had no idea what was happening, but they knew they had to be ready. Jack grabbed his gear, checking his weapon, making sure everything was in place. But deep down, he knew that nothing could prepare them for what was coming. The storm was no longer just a feeling. It was real, and it was coming fast. As Jack looked out at the horizon, he saw a massive fleet of ships descending from the sky. They were unlike anything he had ever seen. Sleek, deadly, and powerful. The enemy had arrived. And this time, they weren't just here for a skirmish. This time, they were here to end the war. The calm before the storm had ended, and Jack Turner was about to find out just how much he was capable of in the face of unimaginable chaos. The battle for humanity's survival was about to begin. This introduction sets up the story with suspense and builds tension, gradually introducing Jack's character and the impending danger. The calm before the storm is shattered with the arrival of the enemy, leaving the audience eagerly anticipating what will happen next. The battle begins, humanity's resolve tested. The ground still trembled beneath Jack's boots as he sprinted toward the armory. The feeling of impending doom was heavy in the air, and every soldier around him seemed to sense it. The distant rumble of the approaching fleet seemed to grow louder with each passing second, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something far bigger than anyone had imagined. As he entered the armory, Jack quickly began to prepare for the worst. His hands moved with practiced ease as he secured his gear, a combat suit, his rifle, grenades, and the standard-issue helmet. But none of these items seemed enough to prepare him for what he could already feel in his gut, a fight that would demand everything from him and his fellow soldiers. "Everyone, suit up," Sergeant Harris shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. His normally gruff demeanor was gone, replaced by a sharp edge of urgency. "Get ready for anything. I don't care if it's an ambush, a full assault, or something worse. You're not here to survive. You're here to fight back." Jack pulled his helmet on and secured it tightly. His heart was pounding. The war had always been something distant, something talked about in briefings and news broadcasts. But now, it was right in front of him, up close, real, and deadly. Outside the armory, chaos was unfolding. Soldiers were rushing to their positions, weapons raised, eyes scanning the horizon. The ships, those dark and foreboding vessels, were closing in rapidly. The sky was alive with the sound of engines, and Jack's stomach churned with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and yet there was a strange sense of determination in the air. Humanity was about to prove that it wasn't ready to just fade away. The first ship dropped low, its sleek metallic surface glinting ominously in the dull light. It was massive, nearly the size of a city block, and its weapons systems were already charging. Jack's eyes widened as he realized how outmatched they were. The Varker fleet had arrived with full force, and the sheer scale of their armada was overwhelming. "Formation," Harris shouted, bringing Jack back to reality. "Stick together. We'd hold this ground at all costs." But deep down, Jack knew that this wasn't just about holding ground anymore. It was about survival. Humanity wasn't just going to let the Varkar win. They couldn't. The stakes were too high. Jack's squad lined up in a defensive position, ready for whatever came next. As the first of the Varkar ships released its troops onto the planet's surface, Jack's breath caught in his throat. The enemy soldiers, humanoid but distinctly alien in appearance, began to descend like a plague of locusts. They were heavily armored, with weapons that seemed to shimmer with dangerous energy. The air around them crackled with anticipation. Then, without warning, the first shots were fired. The sound of blasters and plasma guns filled the air, and the ground erupted into a war zone. Soldiers scrambled for cover, the sounds of explosions deafening as the battle for the planet's survival began in full force. Jack's rifle was steady in his hands as he fired into the advancing enemy. Each shot felt like it could be his last, but there was no time to hesitate. His training kicked in, and with it, the knowledge that there was no turning back. The fate of humanity rested on their shoulders now, and Jack wasn't about to let it slip away. "Keep moving," Harris barked as the Varkar advanced with relentless fury. "We need to hold this position until reinforcements arrive. Do not let them push us back." Jack fired again, the recoil of his weapon making his arms ache, but he didn't stop. The enemy was relentless, but there was something in the way humanity fought back that the Varkar hadn't accounted for. They underestimated the resolve of a soldier, the fire that burned in their hearts when the world was on the line. Jack could feel it with every shot he took. Humanity's spirit wasn't something the Varkar could just crush. The battlefield was a blur of smoke and fire as the two forces collided. Jack's squad fought with everything they had, and even as the odds seemed impossible, there was a small spark of hope. The Varkar might have superior technology and numbers, but humanity had something more valuable: determination and unity. In the midst of the battle, Jack saw Harris duck behind a wrecked transport, his rifle held high. "We can't stop now," he shouted to Jack. "This is the moment we prove that no one can break us. Push them back." Jack nodded, gritting his teeth as he advanced, his eyes locked on the alien soldiers who dared to threaten humanity's future. The battle was far from over, but in that moment, Jack knew that they weren't just fighting to survive. They were fighting to protect everything they had ever known. And if there was one thing humanity had learned over the centuries, it was this: they didn't give up. Not then, not now, not ever. As Jack pushed forward, another explosion shook the ground beneath him. The battle was escalating, and humanity was proving that they would never go down without a fight. Humanity's last stand, unyielding and relentless. The battle had escalated to a point that seemed impossible. Jack crouched behind a half-destroyed structure, the remnants of an old communication tower, his breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. His pulse pounded in his ears as explosions shook the ground, sending plumes of dust and debris into the air. It was chaos all around him. The Varkar had unleashed their full might, their soldiers flooding the battlefield with relentless precision. They were relentless, intelligent, methodical, and calculating. They had the numbers, the technology, and the firepower. Yet, despite all of it, Jack could sense something that made his heart beat faster. It was the humanity that had been buried deep within him, the one that always rose when things seemed darkest. The soldiers around him, they weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for the memory of those who had come before them, for the future of their children, and for the world that had been their home. They fought as if they had nothing to lose, but in reality, they had everything to fight for. "Form up," Sergeant Harris barked, his voice cutting through the cacophony of war. He was a pillar of calm amid the madness, directing the troops with unshakable resolve. "We've got to hold them off. Reinforcements are on the way, but we need to buy them time." Jack didn't hesitate. He tightened his grip on his rifle and moved with swift purpose, his legs carrying him over the battlefield as if driven by a force beyond his control. Around him, soldiers fought with every ounce of their being, their movements sharp and determined. The Varkar advanced, but they had yet to break the human line. Not today. Jack fired his weapon again, sending another Varkar soldier crashing to the ground. The alien's sleek armor wasn't enough to stop the force of the shot, and Jack watched with cold focus as the enemy crumpled. There was no time for hesitation or doubt. This was the fight of their lives. Across the battlefield, Jack could see the Varkar forces slowly adapting to humanity's tactics. They had begun to encircle them, pushing the line back. The weight of the battle bore down on humanity's soldiers, but they held firm. Jack knew they had one advantage the Varkar couldn't replicate: an unyielding will to survive, no matter the cost. As Jack moved, he glanced up to see more Varkar ships descending from the sky, their massive bulk blotting out the sun. The ground beneath him rumbled again as the ships touched down, and Jack knew that reinforcements had arrived, but not from humanity's side. In that instant, Everything became clear. The Varkar weren't just attacking. They were preparing for something much larger. They weren't here to conquer. They were here to wipe them out. The realization struck Jack with the weight of a falling star, but he couldn't afford to think too deeply about it. There was no time for hesitation. The battle was still raging, and every soldier on the ground was playing a part in ensuring humanity's future. "Keep it together," Harris shouted again, rallying the troops. "We stand together or we fall apart. They want to break us, but they don't understand who they're dealing with." Jack felt his pulse steady, his focus sharpening. This was what they had trained for. This was their moment to show the galaxy who humanity was. The Varkar had thought they could crush them with sheer force. But what they didn't know was that humanity was not easily subdued. He rose from his cover, moving to the front lines, and without missing a beat, began firing into the advancing Varkar. His shots rang out one after another, each one a testament to humanity's defiance. The soldiers around him moved with the same determination, returning fire with precision and skill. The tide of battle surged back and forth, the Varkar pushing harder, but humanity's line holding firm. Jack could hear the cries of his comrades and the distant roar of explosions, but in that moment there was only one thing that mattered: surviving long enough to make a difference. They had been underestimated, but they were not going to let their world fall without a fight. For the first time since the battle began, Jack allowed himself to think about what was at stake. This wasn't just a war. It was humanity's stand in the face of annihilation. The galaxy had underestimated them, but they would learn quickly that there was one thing the Varkar hadn't accounted for: humanity's refusal to be erased. In the midst of all the chaos, Jack saw a new light in the eyes of the soldiers around him. They were no longer just fighting to survive. They were fighting for their future. They were fighting to prove that no one could break them. Not the Varkar. Not anyone. Humanity's fight had only just begun, but as the battle raged on, there was one thing Jack knew for sure. They were going to make it count. Whatever came next, they would be ready. The turning point. A soldier's resolve. The sky above had turned a dull shade of red, stained by the massive explosions and the fiery debris falling from the burning Varkar ships. Smoke curled upward, blocking the sunlight as the war raged on beneath the acrid sky. Humanity's forces, battered but unbroken, fought like they had nothing left to lose. Their backs were against the wall, but they were far from giving up. Jack moved quickly across the battlefield, his boots splashing through the muck of the torn-up ground. Around him, explosions lit up the darkened sky, casting an eerie glow on the faces of his comrades. Despite the chaos, there was a strange calm in the air. It wasn't peace, but the kind of resolve that only came when everything else had been stripped away. As he reloaded his weapon, Jack caught sight of Sergeant Harris, who was shouting orders, pushing the soldiers forward with an intensity that felt like it could ignite the very air around them. Harris was everywhere, shouting at the men to hold the line, urging them to fight for every inch of ground they could defend. His voice was a lifeline in the madness. Jack knew what was at stake now. The Varkar weren't just attacking. They were seeking to erase humanity from the galaxy. This wasn't just about defending a planet or a colony. This was about the future of every living human. The odds seemed insurmountable, but Jack felt the fire inside him. The need to fight, to win, burned like a hot coal in his chest. And then, just when it seemed like the Varkar would break through, something unexpected happened. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble, as if the earth itself had woken from a long slumber. The vibration spread, reaching even the farthest corners of the battlefield. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He knew that feeling. It wasn't just the rumble of bombs or the shakes of battle. This was different. "Look!" one of the soldiers screamed, pointing into the horizon. Far beyond the enemy lines, something was emerging, something enormous. It wasn't a ship, not like the Varkar's war machines. No, this was something entirely different, something human. A massive silhouette appeared on the horizon. Humanity's secret weapon, the Titan-class warship. The huge craft, part ship, part fortress, soared over the battlefield like a titan rising from the depths. Its weapons began to power up, casting pulses of energy that sent shockwaves through the air. Humanity had always been resourceful, and the Varkar had underestimated just how far they would go to protect their people. The Titan-class warship was humanity's trump card. Hidden in plain sight, it had been developed in secret, an unstoppable force capable of leveling entire armies. Its size alone was enough to send fear into the hearts of the Varkar, who had never seen anything like it before. A loud booming voice crackled through the comms, the voice of the ship's captain. "This is the Titan 01. We are here to reinforce humanity. Prepare for impact." The Varkar forces, who had been pushing forward with seemingly unstoppable force, hesitated. They were used to dominance, to crushing their enemies with superior technology and sheer numbers. But this was different. The humans had turned the tide with a single move, and the Varkar, for the first time, seemed uncertain. Jack could see the Varkar lines falter as the Titan-class ship opened fire. Blinding beams of energy shot down from its enormous guns, vaporizing anything in its path. The ground shook as the ship's massive thrusters kicked in, sending shockwaves that flattened anything in their wake. It was like a storm, an unstoppable force that swept across the battlefield. But Jack knew this wasn't the end. The Varkar were not known for retreating easily, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. They regrouped, sending out a wave of reinforcements in a desperate attempt to rally. Yet, the arrival of the Titan-class ship had bought humanity a crucial moment, a moment they desperately needed. The tide of battle had shifted. Humanity was not just fighting back anymore. They were making a statement. They have the strength, the resolve, and the firepower to stand against any force in the galaxy. The Varkar had underestimated them, and now they were about to feel the full force of humanity's wrath. "Hold your ground," Sergeant Harris shouted again, his voice still carrying above the chaos. "This is our fight. Don't let them take it from us." Jack stood tall, his resolve hardening. The battle was far from over, but the Varkar had learned a valuable lesson today. Humanity wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for victory. And in that moment, Jack knew that they would never give up. They would never stop fighting, no matter what came next. The tide turns, humanity strikes back. The air buzzed with the energy of the battlefield, the sound of cannons and explosions blending with the occasional crackling of electrical sparks as debris flew everywhere. The sky, once darkened by the smoke of battle, was now illuminated by the searing light of the Titan-class warship's barrage. It was as if a storm had torn through the air, casting everything into chaos. Yet within that chaos, there was clarity. Humanity had found its moment, and now they weren't letting go. The Varkar, once so confident in their overwhelming numbers, now found themselves on the back foot. They had never expected this. The overwhelming firepower of the Titan ship, the sheer size of the human war machine that was now tearing through their ranks. Their warships, once symbols of superiority, now trembled in the face of humanity's might. For the first time, the Varkar knew fear. The ground shook beneath Jack's boots as he ran alongside his comrades, the vibrations of the Titan's guns reverberating through the soil. His pulse raced with adrenaline. He had seen soldiers die, seen entire battalions wiped out in a matter of minutes. But today was different. Humanity was fighting back with everything they had, and there was no sign of stopping. Jack's eyes shifted to the distance, where the Titan's massive form blotted out the sky. The ship's weapons pulsed with lethal precision, sending streaks of death toward the Varkar fleet. The beams from the ship were so bright they could be seen from miles away, cutting through the smoke and fire like a knife through butter. Humanity wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting to win. And Jack felt that fire surge in him again. This wasn't just about duty. It was personal now. "Move! Move!" Sergeant Harris shouted, pulling Jack back to the present. The ground around them exploded, and Jack instinctively dove to the side, narrowly avoiding being hit by the shockwave. He pulled himself up, feeling the weight of his gear as he adjusted his position. "Fire!" a voice screamed nearby. A line of soldiers, including Jack, opened fire on the Varker forces that were attempting to flank them. The battlefield was a blur of movement, human soldiers advancing with determination, Varker forces struggling to adapt to the onslaught. The human resistance was like nothing the Varker had expected. They fought with a ferocity that was born of desperation, but also of purpose. The battlefield was their home, and they would defend it at all costs. As Jack ran forward, he saw something that gave him pause. A group of Varkar warships, battered and smoking from the Titan's relentless bombardment, was beginning to retreat. It wasn't a full retreat, but it was a sign. The Varkar were backing down. They were realizing that humanity wasn't a simple target anymore. "Hold that line," Sergeant Harris shouted as they advanced further, nearing a large enemy artillery position that had been relentlessly firing on their lines. "We break their back today. We end this." The command was simple but full of weight. The Varkar were reeling, but they were still dangerous. They were still capable of turning the tide with one swift counterattack. But humanity was relentless now. They had tasted victory, and they wouldn't let it slip through their fingers. Jack felt that resolve surge in him, and his hands gripped his weapon tighter. The final push began as humanity's forces surged forward, led by the towering Titan-class warship above. Jack and his comrades poured fire into the enemy, systematically dismantling their positions one by one. It felt like the whole galaxy was holding its breath as the human soldiers drove deeper into the heart of the enemy's forces. Then came the sound that Jack would never forget, the unmistakable crackling of the Varkar's communications network. A message, loud and clear, came through the comms. "We are withdrawing. The battle is lost." There was silence for a moment, as if the entire universe had taken a breath. And then humanity erupted. The roar of victory, mixed with the cries of triumph and relief, shook the air. The Varkar, once so sure of their victory, were now fleeing. The battlefield, once a hellscape of destruction, became the proving ground for humanity's resilience. Jack stood still, his breath heavy, as the realization hit him. They had done it. The tide had truly turned. But it wasn't just the Titan-class warship, nor the relentless barrage of firepower that had won this day. It was the soldiers, the men and women who fought without hesitation, without fear. It was the human spirit that had risen above all odds and fought back when the universe had tried to bury them. In that moment, Jack understood. He wasn't just part of a victory. He was part of a movement, a testament to what humanity could achieve when they stood together. And as the Varkar forces retreated into the distance, Jack knew one thing for sure: this was just the beginning. Humanity had proven that when backed into a corner, they would rise up, and when the chips were down, they would fight back, not just for survival, but for victory. And the universe would never forget the day humanity stood tall, proving that no one, not even the mightiest of enemies, could take them down. The enemy retreats. A new dawn for humanity. The ground trembled under the feet of the human soldiers as the last of the Varkar ships fled into the distance. The once oppressive air of battle had lifted, replaced by the weight of silence, a silence that spoke louder than any victory cry. The soldiers, covered in dirt, blood, and sweat, stood still for a moment, staring at the sky as the last remnants of the Varkar fleet vanished beyond the horizon. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. The Varkar were retreating, but the echo of the battle still lingered. This wasn't just a victory, it was a turning point. The weight of their losses, the sacrifices made by each soldier, and the ferocity of their fight were all sealed in this moment. It had cost them everything, but they had fought, and they had won. Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of disbelief wash over him. The Varkar, a force so powerful that it had once seemed invincible, were retreating in defeat. It was a victory that would be spoken of for generations to come, a moment of glory that would be passed down in the stories of humanity's rise to power. But even as the soldiers cheered and celebrated, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The Varker might have retreated, but they weren't gone. The galaxy was vast, and there were still countless threats lurking out there, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "Stay alert," Sergeant Harris's voice cut through the haze of victory. "This fight's not over. We've pushed them back today, but tomorrow could bring something even worse." The words were harsh, but they were true. Humanity had shown its strength, but the war was far from won. The Varker might be retreating, but there were other enemies out there, other factions watching from the shadows, waiting for their own chance to test humanity's resolve. Jack nodded, taking a deep breath as he scanned the battlefield. He could see the wounded, some of them lying motionless, others being tended to by medics. The price of victory had been steep, but it was a price they were willing to pay. The dead would be honored, their names etched into the annals of history, and for those still standing, the fight would continue. "We've got work to do," Jack said, his voice steady. "We can't let our guard down now. Not when we've come this far." As he spoke, he could see the other soldiers gathering, ready to move on to the next task. There was no time for rest. Not yet. Humanity had earned a hard-fought victory, but they knew that the true test of their strength lay ahead. The galaxy was vast, and the enemies they faced were numerous. But Jack had seen something in the eyes of his comrades today, something unshakable. They had fought together, and together they would rise again. The next steps were clear. The war would continue, and humanity would face every challenge head-on, just as they had today. They had learned something vital. When humanity stands together, there is no force in the universe that can stop them. The road ahead, humanity's resolve solidified. The battlefield, once a cacophony of violence and chaos, had fallen silent. The last remnants of the Varker fleet were nothing but specks in the distant sky, retreating to the unknown corners of the galaxy. The ground was littered with the fallen, both human and alien. And yet, despite the carnage, there was a sense of something more profound in the air. Humanity had proven itself, not through some overwhelming weapon or miraculous technology, but through sheer determination, grit, and unity. For the first time in the history of the galaxy, the Varker, those cold, ruthless conquerors, had been forced to retreat. They were not invincible after all. Jack looked around at his comrades, feeling the weight of the moment. He saw soldiers, some weary and bloodied, others with tears in their eyes, not for the loss, but for the triumph. They had done the impossible. And yet, in the back of Jack's mind, a single thought lingered. What comes next? The victory was sweet, but it was fleeting. The Varker might have been pushed back, but their war machine was still vast, and there would be others, other enemies that humanity had yet to face. The galaxy was a vast, unexplored expanse, and for all the victories won today, they were but one small step on a much longer journey. Sergeant Harris approached Jack, his face set in grim determination. "We've earned a rest, but not for long. The Varker will regroup, and they'll come back stronger. We have to stay prepared." Jack nodded, understanding the weight of the surgeon's words. The war wasn't over. It wasn't even close. But what humanity had proven was that they could face down the worst the universe had to offer. And they would do it again. The soldiers began the solemn task of recovering their wounded, preparing to move out, and ensuring that the lines they had drawn were fortified. But even in the midst of these preparations, a quiet pride swelled within Jack. This battle wasn't just a military victory. It was a turning point. It was a statement to the galaxy. Humanity would not bend, would not break. And now, the galaxy would know their name. Jack looked up at the horizon. The sky was still painted with the light of a dying sun, and the distant stars seemed to shimmer a little brighter. It felt like the first light of a new era. The Varker would be back, no doubt, but humanity had found something that would give them strength in the battles to come. It wasn't just weapons or tactics, but something deeper, a sense of unity, a shared resolve that made them unstoppable. "Ready, sir." A voice pulled Jack from his thoughts. It was Lieutenant Daniels, her face painted with dirt and victory. She stood tall, a glint of determination in her eyes. Jack gave a nod. "Let's finish this." And so they marched forward, their steps heavy but resolute. Humanity had shown the universe that they could fight, that they could win, and above all, they had shown that they would never back down. As they walked, Jack couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning. The galaxy was vast, and the road ahead was uncertain, but humanity had earned its place among the stars. And now, the universe would know there was no force, no enemy that could stand in their way. Together, they had proven it, and together, they would face whatever came next.